Hello, everyone. I'm very excited today to be in conversation with Professor Pervez Hoodbhoy. For those of you who don't know, let me introduce Professor Hoodbhoy. Professor Hoodbhoy is currently a professor of physics at Forman Christian College. He's a Pakistani nuclear physicist, activist, science popularizer, author, the recipient of multiple awards, including the UNESCO Kalinga Prize, and he has worked at various universities, including MIT, Princeton University, University of Maryland. Professor Hoodbhoy, an honor to have you.
Thank you.
So I wanted to start by talking about your interest in science because you studied under the Pakistani education system in the 50s and 60s before you went to MIT. So I was wondering whether there were any teachers who inspired you to take up the path of science. How different do you think the education system that you studied in and the state of the current education system in Pakistan right now is?
When I look at my contemporaries, I see that none of them went into science, none of them went into academics, and so I guess I was kind of an anomaly. And it's just accidentally that I got interested in things to do um, with mechanical gadgets. I'd open up everything that moves in the house. I'd There used to be a plaything called Meccano in those days. And maybe that was restricted to those who could afford that toy. And so I got interested in gears and wheels and cogs and levers and that sort of thing. And then I went on to batteries and electromagnets. And then this was before the age of transistors. So fooling around with vacuum tubes, valves. That's how I got interested in science. I wouldn't say that any of my teachers was particularly inspiring. There were a couple who were okay in their fields, but most of them didn't have any really. They didn't like very much what they were doing. So I think that then and now, and I think it's even harder to find teachers of science today in Pakistan who would inspire young people to go into science as a profession. That's maybe that's probably the reason why we have so few good scientists and academics in general.
You've also talked about, you've also been a strong critic of the Pakistani higher education system. And in multiple articles, you've written about it being partly the result of the policies that were
I think
implemented.
this is not going to work. This is I can't hear you, and when I do hear you, it's just fragments here and there.
I'm also, your screen is also glitching. So I think there's a network problem.
Um, Let me see my internet speed. Okay,
All right.
uh, let me get off this and
So you've been a strong critique of the Pakistani higher education system, and you've pointed out that much of the policies that have been implemented at the movement have been the result of the recommendations of Dr. Ataur Rahman, who is one of the most popular scientists in Pakistan, the recipient of it, the highest national civilian award. So, uh, what are the policies that you think he got wrong, which led to the state of this sorry state of the system that it is right now?
I don't think it's as much policies as his crookedness. He is such a disgrace to this country, and he is the recipient of the highest awards of Pakistan. He's also a fellow of the Royal Society. And where should I start by telling you what a fraud this guy is. So I've told him on his face. I've made a video. I've written on this. Nobody dares, nobody contests the facts. But let me repeat to you what some of the facts are. First, he publishes one book every 2 weeks. And in 2021, he had published a total of 22 books. These were edited volumes of about 3, 4, 500 pages each. And from a publisher by the name of Bentham Books. Now, Bentham Books, he puts in brackets Holland, and it gives you the impression as though he's publishing from outside. But in fact, that publishing house is located in Karachi University, next to the institute of which he is head. He has published something like 2,000 papers on natural chemistry, on the chemistry of natural products. And it's the rate of publication is that of one every few days. He has made wild claims such as that floods and earthquakes in Pakistan were the result of an American experiment carried out in Alaska by the name of HAARP, high altitude radio frequency pulses, something to investigate the ionosphere with. He says those caused the floods in Pakistan because they were used for weather modification. He has swindled crores of rupees, bought properties across the country, and this has been documented. But all this is like water over a duck's back. And so it's as much his policies as his personal crookedness and the crookedness of his students and those around him that I think is responsible for what has happened in Pakistan. Now, when people don't take notice of these allegations, let me call what I'm saying allegation. There's proof after proof after proof of this, but when people don't bother to look at the proofs and they say, he makes us feel good because our people now are publishing so fast and so rapidly that we've risen in the world accounting of how many research papers are produced by which country. When people don't want to look at the facts, then that's a sure sign that people don't care about science. They just care about looking good.
But how do you think that someone who publishes in like predatory journals and uh, fakes his own credentials, how does someone like him get through the highest echelons and get through the good books of all of the prime ministers or the government or the establishment?
Well, right now he's not in the good books, but he was in good books with the previous government, which was Imran Khan's. And in fact, Imran Khan gave him the project of converting the prime minister's house in Islamabad into a university. And so he asked for 30 crore rupees to do that. Fortunately, Imran Khan was out of government before that project took over, and before it attained any kind of speed on that. But had Imran Khan stayed on, and there's a chance that he will come back, then that project could conceivably be revived, and another 30 crore rupees would go down the drain, because there's not a hope in hell that you can convert a house, an estate, I should say, that has been made expressly for the prime minister, the prime minister's various supporting staff, foreign dignitaries, all that, that you could convert it into something that's suitable for a university. Plus the fact that whole area, which is next to the diplomatic enclave here in Islamabad, is is always under very high security precautions because you want to protect diplomats and foreign dignitaries and so forth. And so much of the time, it is closed off to ordinary people. And so that would certainly include students as well, students and teachers and employees of that university as well. So it's just completely nonsensical, and yet 30 crore rupees were sanctioned for it.
So the way it seems to me, the reason these policies work is because they support a particular group of people, which is that they get their PhDs, their degrees easily enough, and they get to stay and have jobs. So do you think that is the reason that this policy works? Because it the number of papers you publish does not say nothing about the quality of the papers as such, and it will not get you jobs in, say, abroad in good universities, which will look at your H index and the quality instead of the quantity.
Absolutely. Look, there's a disease now, and it's not just in Pakistan, it's to an extent in China and in India and everywhere in the world, I'd say. It's just that it's more prominent in Pakistan than elsewhere. The fact is that in the internet age, it's very easy to get your paper published. Your paper can be completely stupid, it can be irrelevant, it can be faked, it can be plagiarized, it can have manufactured data in it. It can have ideas stolen from here, there, sometimes disguised, sometimes not. All these things are possible, and every single paper can get published somewhere or the other. And so, what used to be at one time something that was very sacred, that is to say, the printed word, now is no longer that. Once upon a time, it used to be the case that here in Pakistan, if you wanted to become assistant professor, all you needed was one paper published in some journal. If you wanted to become a full professor, you needed 20 years and 12 papers. And now what happens is that every graduate student who's doing his PhD has something like 20 papers or 15 papers, God knows what, published here, there, whatever, repeated, forged, plagiarized, whatever. And so the whole thing has completely lost meaning. So, in spite of this, yeah, it's very useful because when somebody wants to get a job in a Pakistani university, he has to show that he or she has produced so many papers. And that habit has to be kicked. It has to be made to go away. I don't know how it is like in India. I suppose it's there to an extent, but perhaps not to this extent as here. The fact is that these days, papers, the number of papers is not any indication of one's grasp over the field, one's innovation or discoveries in the field. And so, of course, the real question is, how do you judge that? How do you estimate it? How do you make criteria that allow you to tell sensibly between who you should take and who you should reject? It's not an easy question, but it's only possible to resolve once you have a sufficient number of practitioners of the field who've actually managed to make an impact upon that field and who have learned its rules and its guidelines and are rigorous in the scientific way of thinking. It is only they who can then properly decide who is to be taken and who is not to be taken, who is to be promoted and who is not to be promoted.
But along with this systematic problem, as it were, there is also the problem of ideology, and especially at primary education level, how much do you think the religious extremist views on science impact the level of science education in Pakistan? And does that creep into textbooks as well, or does it only exist at the societal level?
Religious dogma, it feeds into textbooks, but only in, I'd say, certain places. Like, it's kind of hard to get religious stuff into a math book, but it's easy to get it into a biology book because there the theory of evolution comes about. And then you run into the question of how uh, humans came to planet Earth, whether there was a first man and woman, Adam and Eve, in fact, because that's what the monotheistic religions believe in. That it all started when God decided to make man and woman, and then there's Genesis, creation. Now, Darwinian theory goes in the other direction. It says that what happened was atoms and molecules coming together, making simple forms of life, which then evolved and evolved. And from that great grand tree of life, there emerged eventually the primates, and man is one branch of primates. So that thing is very difficult to swallow for those who are religious. And therefore, there has been throughout, I'd say, for the last, ever since Darwinism 200 years ago, there has been a reluctance and an absolute refusal, I'd say, to accept that on part of most believers. And by most believers, I mean believing Christians as well as believing Muslims and Jews as well. So that has crept into the textbooks. Now, as it turns out, you can't do without evolution at all in biology. It's like trying to do physics without Newton's laws. So, what happens in Pakistani textbooks is that, yeah, there's a sort of description of evolution, but then there's a disclaimer. The disclaimer says, you're going to learn about evolution, but don't take it seriously. It's all nonsense. It's illogical. And in fact, one book that is published here, it says to say that simple forms of life led to complex forms of life is as stupid as saying a three-wheeler rickshaw collides with another three-wheeler rickshaw and makes a taxi. So there's that kind of disclaimer. And as a consequence of that, evolution is not taught. Is it may be there in the books, but no teacher teaches it, and it never comes as a question in any examination. So I guess that's one example, and a very striking example of the kinds of restrictions that religion places upon science, upon science teaching here in Pakistan.
But this level of teaching essentially means that you will not be able to produce biologists at all, because for you to be a biologist or an evolutionary biologist, you have to adhere to the framework of evolution, which is at the foundation of biology, modern biology as it exists at the moment. So by not teaching that, I think what people are essentially doing is that they're entirely closing the gate for an entirely new generation, which, if they would have been taught evolution, they would have been able to become scientists. They would have been able to become, they probably have the brains to do it, but they don't have the framework because the state does not teach them that.
Yeah, and it's not just that is one part of the curriculum which is excised. It's that the scientific method is not is not used, is not emphasized, even if it is sometimes mentioned. And so the really important thing is that unless you learn to question, unless you learn to demand proof for what you're being taught, and unless this becomes a habit, then you don't become a good scientist. Or, in fact, you don't become a scientist at all. At best, you become a kind of technician who knows that you mix these two liquids and you look for the precipitate and you then check for this and check for that. That sort of thing is something which can be automated. It doesn't lead to new discoveries, it doesn't lead to new products. And that's what I think is really missing in the Pakistani system of education.
Do you think religion and science can be reconciled?
Well, I guess, anything can be reconciled with anything. The problem is that nobody is able um to figure out how to get the two together when both claim to describe the material world. As long as religion is restricted to the metaphysical, so if it's about mythology or it's about life after death, then it's okay. Then it doesn't matter what you think in that regard. Who is the biggest god of all? How many gods there are? What do they do? Who did what at which instant? I mean, who cares? What I want to know is what happens when you throw electrons off a nucleus? How will they scatter? Will I be able to look at the magnetic moment of the neutron, etc., etc.? So, um, in that question, the one that I just asked, there's no effect whatsoever of any kind of theology entering. And so, if religion was only about the metaphysical, that would be fine. There'd be no conflict there. But it's when religion claims that truths are embedded in some holy text. That holy text could be the Bible, the Quran, the Vedas. It could be anything. Um, but when the claim is made that the world is this way or that way, whether it's the earth going around the sun or the sun going around the moon, or the roundness or the flatness of the earth, or um, how humans came into existence and so forth. When there is a claim made in any holy text which intrudes upon science as a means of explanation of the natural universe and its phenomena, then the conflict becomes irresolvable. And I'd also like to say one thing. I know there are lots of people everywhere, and they're there in Pakistan, and they're there in India, who say, but what science is something new. Our religions are old, and the religions have all the knowledge that there could be. And they say, oh,
That
let's
science
say,
has not discovered it.
and they say, we told you that the universe started with a big bang. Yeah, great. Why didn't they tell us that before Hubble's discovery 100 years ago? Those texts have been around for 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years. How comes it that they're telling us now? How are they telling us that, yeah, we knew about DNA from those days? Oh, yeah? Why did they have to wait for Watson and Crick, etc., etc.? There's not one experiment, there's not one product, there's not one machine that has been made from from a formula from any holy book. And if I'm wrong, give me an example.
Well, as Christopher Hitchens once said, that religion is our first attempt to make sense of the world, and as such, is the weakest attempt. But I also wanted to ask you what you think of Stephen Jay Gould's argument that religion and science is sort of non-overlapping magisteria, that is, they deal with two different topics and therefore they can exist uh, alongside each other because they do not deal with the same thing. Religion deals with the meaning or purpose of life, science deals with the material
Yeah, I
aspect.
guess as long as the two mind their own business, that would be fine. But the problem is that's not the case. The problem is that both the Bible and the Quran and the Vedas and all the holy books, they intrude upon the physical universe. They said it was just metaphysics. I'd say that's fine. I have no problem with that. Who is a holy man and who is not? What do I care? I only care about what's under the microscope or can be detected using the James Webb Space Telescope or using the particle accelerator at CERN or whatever. Give me something that is detectable, observable, then that's fine. Now, as long as religion minds its own business, I have no problem with it.
Uh, but there are scientists who claim, like Christian evolutionary biologists, they claim that evolutionary biology and Christianity can be reconciled. Like Francis Collins, who was, I think, the head of the Human Genome Project. So, uh, what do you think about those claims of, say, Muslims or Christians who say that evolution is completely in line with our religious beliefs and do not contradict?
Well, evolution is in line with only one thing, and that is total randomness in terms of mutation. And then mm, with the principle of natural selection, which says that those mutations will survive which are best adapted to the environment. And so this is what then accounts for the evolution of the species. Now, there's no grand design over here. And suppose one had a reset button, which you could press and go back to 3.5 billion years ago when the first prokaryotes came into existence, and which in turn came into existence because there were the basic amino acids made from the elements, from hydrogen, nitrogen, carbon, oxygen, etc. Suppose you were to press that reset button, you'd get something very different. Now, where's the great grand design over there? I don't know if we would have humans. If we had humans, they would very likely be totally different from the humans that exist today. So I don't see where the consistency comes from. It's um, Collins can say what he likes, but how is he going to get away from the fact that before our very eyes, new species are coming into existence? I mean, look at the variants of COVID, the Omicron and the this Micron and the that Micron. All those are new things, and they're happening just as we look at them, as we look through our microscopes. Now, of course, we don't have um, enough time to see how larger things evolve because that requires a that requires biological time scales. But there is certainly no inevitability in having the world as it exists today. There is certainly no evidence of a grand design.
Besides, there are vestigial organs which disprove, the existence of grand design, because it, a a creator would create human beings or animals imperfectly. So, but we have organs, vestigious organs from our evolutionary past, which are of absolutely no use to us.
Yeah. Yeah, I wouldn't. My poor cat actually doesn't know what to do with its tail. And if you and I had tails, we wouldn't know what to do with it either. And yet it'd be there because, well, evolution needed it at some stage for some purpose.
Do you think it's possible to find beauty and wonder in science? Because Keats once accused Newton of robbing the beauty of a rainbow because he explained the rainbow away to materialistic, to facts, let's say. Do you think there is beauty in science? Is it possible to find beauty and solace and wonder in discoveries of scientific findings?
Yeah, well, the beauty of science is one thing, and it's certainly there. The very high degree of symmetry, the fact that with such a small number of principles we can explain so much. The aesthetics of science, and particularly of theoretical physics, lies in the fact that those those abstract creations of the mind somehow find application in the real world. So that's the beauty of science. But can a scientist appreciate music or poetry or art the way that somebody untutored in science can do? Of course, we're we can do that. We're human beings. We're we have uh, our tastes, some of which are acquired, some of which are intrinsic. And so the beauty of the rainbow is not lost upon scientists at all. Yeah, so Keats, Tennyson, Wordsworth, yeah, they were all um, very sensitive to the beauties of nature. But so can scientists be. But scientists would have an additional degree of understanding. They would know that, yeah, if you have these puffy clouds up in the sky, well, what is it that makes them puffy and makes them capable of floating at this height as compared to storm clouds which are dark and menacing looking? Well, it's the size of the water drops. It's the difference in the densities. It's the currents within them and so forth. But does that diminish the the awe, the wonder? I don't think it has to. I think to be able to appreciate these wonders of nature, or to appreciate that which has been created by other human beings, is not diminished by your understanding of science itself.
I agree with you, and I think the best example of this would be Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, which is beautifully written, just as a piece of literature. It's a wonderful work of prose, and this he is very interested in showing the beauty that comes around with the theory of evolution, the famous passage on endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful coming into being. So there are multiple aspects of that in Darwin's theory as well. Uh, I wanted to ask you about pseudoscience because you've spoken a lot on it. And as it happens, because of YouTube and social media, people are now being more drawn into, say, pseudoscientific beliefs, say, uh, whether it's superstitions, whether it's paranormal, because it's easier now to uh, magnify the beliefs which are held by a minority of actual experts, not just pseudoscience, but pseudo-archaeology, pseudo-history, and all of that. Are you worried about that? And how do you think you can maybe fight that?
I I lost you.
So I was talking about pseudoscience and its proliferation of YouTube, and I was asking you about whether you're worried about it and how do you think we can, fight it out.
Ah, pseudoscience is a curse everywhere. It's a curse now that one can just take one's mobile camera, mobile phone, and record whatever nonsense and then post it onto social media. And in time, it will appeal to some people who will magnify it and so forth. So, how does one know truth from false? It's become a bit harder, but I think the protection comes from a good education, comes from adherence to basic scientific principles, and comes from asking the right questions. So, depending on what the particular claim is made, one can ask questions which which can be investigated using the internet itself, and there you have to train yourself so that you can ask the right questions. For example, there was this claim made by a person here in Pakistan who said he could make a car that would run only on plain water, no petrol, no diesel, nothing except plain water, and it would go on running forever. And he took in a lot of people. This includes ministers in the government, big journalists, famous journalists, and even people like Dr. A.Q. Khan, the famous nuclear scientist of Pakistan. Now, with just
The
a few
father of atom bomb.
questions, one could have demolished that imposter. And those are pretty obvious questions. First, hey, if cars can be made to run on water, why hasn't the rest of the world discovered it? Why did somebody from some small town in Pakistan have to discover it first? First question. Second question, if it is possible to run a car on water only and nothing else is being added, can I go and look at the exhaust of that car and check to see if it is producing, let's say, carbon dioxide gas? Now, nobody ever thought of that, and it's such an easy test to do. All you do is you take the gas and you pass it through lime water, and if it turns milky, well, it's carbon dioxide. See, two, three, four questions, simple ones, and you can immediately smell whether this thing uh, you can smell that this thing has something wrong. And this was just by way of example, but any claim that is made, let's say somebody says that I've invented a COVID vaccine. Well, what would be the appropriate questions to ask? I leave that for you to discover. If somebody says honey is the way to uh, to cure all infections, well, then I'll say, okay, uh, you want to try it? Has it been tried? Where has it been tried? Where are the statistics, the data that it did cure infections? Would you be willing to try it? Etc. So there is a way to tackle pseudoscience, and it's different for every claim that's made.
It's interesting that you mentioned COVID vaccine because last year, a Ayurved alternative medicine healer, uh, holy man as it were, claimed to have discovered the cure for COVID, and that was magnified by the government of India. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but there is a separate ministry in the government of India dedicated entirely to the so-called traditional medicines, homeopathy, Ayurveda, Unani, and because it's called Ayus. And only recently, I think last week, the Prime Minister inaugurated the National Institute of Homeopathy with government funds and public funding, and it has an operation theater. I have no idea what homeopaths operate on.
Yeah, well, uh, in this regard, Pakistan not may not be as advanced as India is. We don't have government sponsored university for homeopathy. However, there is there was a university established by Imran Khan, and it was a university on Sufi studies. So, how Sufis would solve the world's problems, and as part of that, there was also Sufi medicine. It's called Al Qadir University, something like that. Well, the good thing is that it doesn't have any students because nobody wants to go there. They know that when they get a degree from that, they're not likely to find a job. So ultimately, I guess it depends upon who can get employment and who cannot. If you go to a stupid university like that, the chances are that your future is not going to be very bright.
So, in your book, Islam and Science, you mention about how the philosopher of ancient times, Islamic times, used to craft out philosophies differently for the masses and for the elite, which is to say that there were different philosophies dedicated to that. Do you think that methodology still exists, or do you think this could be a strategy perhaps to, you know, convince the masses to another way rather than the way in which they will not understand? Perhaps it's more complex or whatever.
Well, I guess those times, the medieval times, were very different in that information was not accessible to everyone. Now it's different. Now, those who are literate and those who are educated, at least to some degree, can hook onto um, the internet and get answers to their questions. But even so, there are there is a sufficiently large number of people in Pakistan who are taken in by the peers, the Maulvis, the mullahs, the muftis, and so forth, and they take them very, very seriously. So here we do have the situation where the Maulvis do one thing, but tell another thing to their followers. To give you a very concrete example, there's a very famous preacher over here by the name of Maulana Tariq Jamil. The guy has a big beard and he's so popular that Imran Khan would invite him to the prime minister's house and get him to preach at every. mm, He would be accompanying Imran Khan on his public tours and so forth. And this guy would preach that the cure for all illnesses, including cancer itself, any terminal illness as well, comes from eating a certain kind of khajur, uh, a date, and this is the one that is grown in Saudi Arabia in a place called Ajwa. So the Ajwa khajur was the cure to everything. Now this Mr. Maulana gets a heart attack, and he's warned by his doctor that things are going to get really serious. So get a stent put into you. And so the Maulana goes to a hospital and he has a stent put into him. Instead of eating ajwa khajur, he does that. So, what we were talking about earlier, it's one thing for the masses who are stupid, and it's one thing for the manipulators, the the mullahs, the pundits, the whatever. They are the ones who understand sort of where things are, but they will do things to promote their personal power and wealth.
Well, they're the best way to describe them would be as charlatans and frauds. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, I also wanted to talk about uh, the state of Pakistan, a bit of politics, because you've also waded in on that. You've written multiple articles and you regularly write in the Economic and Political Weekly. Uh, so, how much of the present crisis, in terms of the political crisis, the identity crisis, do you think can be traced back to the founding movement of Pakistan?
Um, I think the fact that today Pakistan is finding itself directionless is precisely because there was no thought behind Pakistan other than we can't live with Hindus. So the two nation theory was all about that. It said, according to Mr. Jinnah, that there are only two nations that live on this subcontinent. One is Hindu, the other is Muslim. They have different histories, they have different tastes, different cultures, different heroes. And so we can't live together, so let's go make Pakistan. And of course, they did make Pakistan, and 1971 showed that it wasn't enough to have simply, uh, it wasn't enough to have religion as the basis of a state. You needed much more, and Pakistan didn't have that. And today it is still searching for what ought to be the basis for Pakistan. Unfortunately, there's been so little learning by our ruling class. They still insist that the two nation theory is the basis for Pakistan, although it was so clearly disproved. But because they lack imagination, they keep insisting that, and they make it punishable by law to contest the two nation theory. Sometimes I wish I could go and tell them, hey, the two nation theory wasn't really Mr. Jinnah's. It was it was Veer Savarkar's two nation theory. It was then Golwalkar who then took it over. And so it's nothing original. It's an old and failed idea. It was useful only for mobilizing people at one point in time, and now you're whipping a dead horse. It will not move if you say that the two nation theory is the basis for Pakistan, because nobody now cares a damn about that, even if you say so.
Well, what is the use of the two nation theory now? I mean, you have Pakistan, and now you have a small minority, and the propagation of the two nation theory now only harms the
So it
small
really doesn't make
2%
sense
minority.
anymore. And when you ask people, they get angry. I mean, if you ask people on the other side, they get angry. Why are you questioning the basis of Pakistan? I say, sure, I must question the basis, because all the Hindus have left, all the non Muslims have left, well, virtually. Just 3% of the population is non Muslim. So why the heck do you need it? Why don't you get sensible and realize that a nation exists only when people have friendly relations with other people belonging to that same nation? And we don't have friendly relations. The people in Balochistan look upon the Punjabis as occupiers. The 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 Pathan population, it sees the government in Islamabad as oppressive. And why don't you, instead of saying that all Muslims are one, go and look at the real problems, the problems which come from discrimination, which come from a feeling of hurt, of a feeling of injustice, of inequitable distribution of resources and power, and so forth. So I guess that's the blindness that comes about when power is concentrated in one part of the country or in one elite class. And so it's the class that now controls Pakistan, or rather has controlled Pakistan all along. Earlier, it was the feudal lords. Then it became the feudal lords together with the military. And now it's the feudal lords and the military and uh, the political class, which has enriched itself, which inveigled itself into power, and to an extent that is now shared with the judiciary as well. So there is a 2% or a 3% part of the population that essentially governs the remainder.
Now, you've argued in an article written in 2007 that Jinnah's argument about the state of Pakistan post partition was at best ambiguous. He was not clear about what sort of state he wanted, whether he wanted an Islamic state or a secular state. Uh, and you mentioned in that article Istiaq Ahmed, and in his recent book, Professor Ahmed argues that Jinnah throughout from 1930s wanted Pakistan to be an Islamic state with Sharia. That is, he explicitly claimed that, and that the few times, the two times that he did disavow were intended for different audience for pragmatic reasons rather than superficial reasons. So do you think that argument holds, or do you still think that Jinnah was ambiguous about the state that he wanted?
So, is your question, did Jinnah have a vision for Pakistan?
Yes. Did he want an Islamic state?
Oh, did Jinnah want an Islamic state? Um, Probably not. Did he want a secular state? Probably did. But what was it that he articulated? Well, both this and that, but mostly that this had to be a state for Muslims. Now, he did not want the nature of the state to be discussed, because if it was to be this or to be that or to be that, there'd always be people who would be questioning that no, it shouldn't be this way, it should be that way, and that would have split the movement. So Jinnah was very, very astute, very sharp. He said, let's make Pakistan first and then we'll see what it's all about. And this is why he expressly told students at Aligarh Muslim University back in 1946 or so, he says, if any of you ask me what Pakistan should be, I'll say that you are against the Pakistan movement. Because this will divide us. Let's make the state first, and then we'll see. So um, I would say that even if he had some personal preferences, he didn't really care. All he wanted was partition itself. And it was he was not a visionary. He was he he didn't care very much either way, I'd say. And he wasn't terribly well read either. Yeah, he used to read newspapers, but I don't see him espousing any kind of political philosophy either. So, to him, whatever Pakistan was to be would be under him. The most important thing would be that it would be under him. That's why he took over as Governor General. So, Governor General means everybody else is below him. It wasn't to be a democracy, it was to be his personal rule, and that's what Pakistan was, which of course didn't work out very well because when he died in 1948, um, it wasn't clear what Pakistan was all about. And yeah, sure, there had been partition, there had been separation, the two nation theory had worked out and all that. But here was a country that was run by the feudal elites, which didn't have any vision except of how to enrich themselves. And so there was never any land reform. There was so much infighting about who should be prime minister that essentially the Muslim League fell apart after 3 years. By 1951, it was pretty much gone. And Jinnah left no cadres of political activists, or he didn't, because he didn't have a vision. Nobody knew what Pakistan was to be about, and so nobody picked up the baton after that.
And I think this begs a very important question, which is a very simple question. What is Pakistan? Because every nation has its own self narrative, its own self history, its own, as Benedict Anderson would say, imagined communities. What is the imagination of Pakistan?
There used to be a self image that it's the largest Muslim nation. It's something that will lead the Ummah. And now that has been pretty much dented because economically it is not strong. And now that the euphoria over the bomb has worn off, it's pretty much clear that Pakistan is on its own. It doesn't have a whole lot of support from other Muslim countries. Saudi Arabia is something that it is dependent on and not the other way around. And so the question of what is Pakistan is uh, is um, is not raised. But I guess I could ask the same question of somebody living in Norway. What? Why do you exist? Why is Norway a state? Why do you have Norwegian passport? The answer would be, heck, what do I care? I'm Norwegian, so that's good enough for me. So over time, people develop national identities for good or for bad. You see now that Bangladesh has developed a national identity. My contention is that if people live together long enough, then they will develop some kind of a national identity.
I think we should end this here. Professor Hoodboy, it was an honor talking with you. Thank you very much for doing this.